Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Farmers Weekly's Renewables webinar. I'm Susie Horn, Farmers Weekly's business editor. I grew up on farms in East and North Yorkshire, where my brothers are arable and sheep farmers, but at the moment with no renewable energy projects. So tonight, first of all, thanks to everyone for joining the webinar and to our panel for their time and their expertise. I'm sure we're going to have a good run through lots of considerations for renewable energy on farm, whether that's your own installation or a leased site. We're going to have 3 short presentations on different aspects of renewables, and then we'll open up the discussion to the questions that we've had that have come in advance of the webinar and those that come in during the event. So I'll introduce our panel first, and then a little bit of housekeeping about how the questions work. First of all, we have Chris Dyer from Bidwells. Chris is a partner in the Energy and Renewables team at Bidwells. He's working on projects nationwide, and as a land agent and a rural surveyor, he's worked with lots of landowners and farmers to develop renewable energy projects on their land across a wide range of technologies. And identifying potential new sites is part of Chris's regular work. Then we have Alex Tomlinson, who has specialised in energy for 6 years. He's head of the energy department at law firm Davies and Partners, and has acted for a broad range, both of energy developers and landowners, on all projects of all sizes and types, from small-scale greenfield sites to big rooftop projects and some nationally significant projects involving several landowners at one time. And then Kate Hardy is going to give us the sort of tax and finance aspect of renewables. Kate's the Farms and Estates Director at accountant Albert Goodman. She's worked for more than 20 years with rural and small business clients in Dorset and Somerset, and much of this work covers the many issues involved in farm and business tax planning. So each of the presenters is going to give us a short presentation talking about the aspects of their expertise that are involved in advising farmers on renewable energy. And then after those presentations, we'll open up the discussion and deal with some of the questions that we've had a lot sent in advance. So we'll deal with some of those and get answers to as many as we can. And then also take some of the questions that you put in. Please do type the questions in the box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as we can. I think the webinar is expected to last for about an hour and 15 minutes, and it will be available on demand afterwards, and you will get an email to let you know when the recording's ready. So we will kick off with Chris Dyer from Bidwells. Chris, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I didn't have anything too sort of formal to present at this stage, but the main thing I thought was worth commenting on was just sort of the context that inspired hosting this webinar at this time of the calendar. So as I'm sure a lot of people on this call will be aware, there was a recent announcement by the Prime Minister to make a bit of a change to national planning policy framework to try and support onshore wind farms within England. I'm going to quickly couch this just to confirm that we're largely going to be talking around England here rather than too much on Wales and Scotland. Planning rules in Wales and Scotland have been more favourable to wind farms than they ever have been in England. So most of the conversation is going to focus around England. But we've seen this announcement that's intended to bring more support for onshore wind in England. I must admit that once you go and read some of the detail of what's happened, it's a bit of tweaking around the edges, but it's not fundamentally changing anything as far as I can tell. But what I think is really interesting is that it does show the direction of travel, that there's public desire for more renewable energy and more support for net zero targets. And with the fact that we've got a new general election coming up next year, there's a little bit of that electioneering going on. Other parties are trying to start lobbying and do what they can to win votes. And I think renewable energy is going to be a sizable feature in those discussions. So although the immediate announcement doesn't really change things too much, it is showing the direction of travel. And I think almost regardless of what comes out of the next election, we can probably say that there's going to be some policy changes. And that's ultimately what's inspiring a little bit of confidence in the markets. So acting for landowners, I'm now starting to see a few developers who are actively approaching them to secure land to do wind farm developments. They all acknowledge that planning policy is going to be slow. They can't just check in a planning application today and expect it to pass. But they're expecting that with the election, with policy change, now's the time to start preparing, start securing some land, gearing up for that planning application, lobbying government, so that in 3-5 years' time, they might be in a position to submit that planning application. So now just seemed a really pertinent time to start that conversation. And although a developer knocking on the door today cannot be in a position to submit a planning application immediately, now is still quite a good time to engage in those conversations and start thinking about, do we want to be at the forefront of that? If policy changes, if the floodgates open, do we want to be those ones at the forefront of that, pushing, and we're the first ones through the gate? I probably won't get into anything else, otherwise I'll end up waffling too much. So I'll hand back to Susie.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. So we'll move straight on to Alex then to talk about some of the legal aspects of renewable energy projects. Alex.
Thanks, Susie. Yeah, hi. Pleasure to be on the webinar, really. And I wanted to just set it that I'm a commercial property for solicitor for 12 years and having been involved in grid scale energy projects for around 6 years. So what I wanted to do at this webinar is really will bring to the table the legal things to consider with these kind of renewable projects. So wind, but also solar and other renewable projects. So what I wanted to do is in this initial intro is just to pose a few legal questions to consider, almost pre-approach by developer or getting geared up with a possible renewable development. And the first thing that being a property solicitor is that I look at is the title. So quite often, the vast majority of times now, people have landowners have their title registered at the land registry. Sometimes it is still unregistered, and therefore the deed's evidence of ownership is derived from the physical documents themselves, whether that's in being held with a bank or in a filing cabinet somewhere. So that gives us boundaries, which is a really key element to establish first of all ownership of the land in question, the proposed possible development site, and then also really importantly what's on that title. I've come across examples where there have been wayleaves, easements, rights of way, restrictive covenants, so promises that bind the land, and in one instance a development, a number of acre ground mounted solar just had to be essentially cut in half. Half of the development couldn't proceed because of the complicated set of land rights over half the property. And as you look at the property, it looks fine physically, but the underlying level of complexity on the title stuff actually shut down half of that development. It's rare, but when that happens, then that puts into question the kind of financial viability. So really key is having a look at the title. Another key element is if you've got a lender who's secured their mortgage on the property, it's starting a dialogue with them. So approaching a relationship manager and saying that this is something you're looking to look into, because I don't think I've come across an example where lenders have said no, but developers as well as lenders want the certainty to the approval of the lender to the project. And sometimes I must confess I wince sometimes when I see AMC. Not that they say no, but it it does take longer. Some lenders are better than others at providing that consent. So the quicker you start that kind of dialogue, the better. Another thing to just consider is your occupation, so tenancies, so whether you've got agricultural holding that tenancies and when they were granted, just that has a bearing on succession, or alternatively the farm business tenancies, and that has another significant implication regarding the availability of land and the negotiating strengths between landowner and occupier, based on their succession rights and their rights to occupy. So again, it's something that we can look to negotiate and discuss, but the sooner that you've got copies that you can have a look at, then it helps kind of start the groundwork to organise the legal infrastructure necessary for these kind of projects. And then the other one I wanted to just mention was planning ties. So if you've got planning permission with a condition that requires land to be used for ag tags or agricultural ties relating to a specific site, then that also has a bearing. So I hope that gives a bit of a flavour of just some of the initial legal things that we draw on when looking to progress a possible renewable site. So passing back over to you, Susie.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. Yes, I'm sure that's raised lots of questions and thoughts already. Thank you. We'll move straight on to Kate to talk about tax and finance. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Susie. As Susie would have mentioned, I look after more diversified farming businesses. Being in the Dorset area, I tend to look after businesses with either furnished holiday lets or campsites, but also looking at diversified businesses with renewables and B&G. And actually, with a lot of these different diversifications, the tax implications are very similar. And I would mirror what Alex said, in that actually having these conversations early with us is the main point. Come to us at the very start so that we can look at the tax planning and what things that we can put in place to try and mitigate those tax implications. So from our point of view, from looking at the tax, I mean, there's a number of taxes to consider. The first one, I suppose, predominantly being the income tax position when you're looking at some of these solar agreements and looking at the amount of income that you're going to receive. So that's a first consideration. Some of that income, if you're receiving that on your own, personally, could push you up into higher rates or additional rates. It could mean that you're losing your tax-free personal allowance. And for some, like myself with children, that means that you could be affected by the high income child benefit charge. So that's a first starting point, but income tax isn't always the driver. We also like to think that some of these agreements that come through actually start the ball rolling with more long-term succession planning and getting those conversations started. Some of these agreements now, I think, are around about 35 years we're seeing. And so who do you want to receive that income going forward? Will you still be about to receive that income? And is this an opportunity for you to pass that income on to the next generation? So there's lots of discussional points before we actually start going, this is the right position for yourselves. Every situation is very different. And once you've looked at that and considered that, the next point we would look at is the actual structure of the business. So who is actually going to receive this? Is it going to be through a sole trade? Are you going to be using a partnership? Or if you're already using a partnership, would you look at using a limited liability partnership, limited company, mixed partnership? So there's quite a few structures that you could actually use. And we use a mixture of those depending on the individual circumstances for when we're looking at putting any of these agreements in place. If you're thinking of using a limited company, it's then putting how you put that land into the company and looking at the capital gains tax implications of doing so, and also being considerate of the stamp duty implications. So again, it's worth coming to us and having those discussions first off. One of the questions I did have was in respect of inheritance tax. So inheritance tax we'll be covering in a bit more detail, but you also would like to set up the right structure so that you are mitigating your inheritance tax position. So looking at it in the whole. But as I said, I think the main point is to get the professionals involved at the very beginning. And that's not just ourselves. We tend to work with solicitors, land agents, and so forth as a roundtable discussion to actually make sure that we're getting the best for those clients. That's a bit there. Is that okay, Susie? Oh, Susie, you're on mute.
There we are. Thank you.
Okay, sorry.
Apologies, everyone.
That's all right.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Kate. Thanks, everyone. So we will go. Just question that just occurred to me while you were all speaking really is about timescales. And a couple of you mentioned getting paperwork in order and knowing what the lie of the land is in all sorts of ways before anything can really go ahead. So I suppose that's the first thing. But I was interested to just ask all of you in terms of your experience so far, Alex and Chris, in terms of when once an idea or an approach has been made, how long does it take then? And it'd be different for the different technologies. How long does it then typically take from saying, yes, we're going to go ahead with this, given that all the checks and balances have got to be sorted out, to generating energy on whatever day one is? And then after that, Kate, in terms of thinking about structures and who holds the land and how it's held, what sort of timescale do you need to put, if things like that need to be put in place, you're probably going to be thinking a couple of years really in order for everything to be sorted and qualifying for whatever reliefs or allowances.
Yeah, there's planning before, isn't there? But also after.
Yeah, I think that the very simple answer to that is that it's not a quick process. Even when subsidies were available, it might have been possible to build a small solar farm in 3 years, but that's virtually unheard of now in the modern market. What might be worth flagging at this point is that a lot of the timescales of big commercial developments is very much tied to the grid connection. So we'll probably come on to grid in quite some detail. I'm conscious we've got quite a few questions
about that. Yes, yeah.
Ultimately, we kind of work backwards from the grid. So if the grid say your connection is happening in 2030, we can't physically build a project before then, but that gives us nearly a decade to get everything else in place. Yeah. So I would still say that we want to get all of the contracts and the tax measures and everything else in place as soon as possible, so that we've got time to give the developer to get their planning applications in and implement all those changes ourselves. But it's certainly not something where we'll be rushing to hit a 5 p.m. deadline on Friday. It's going to be something that will take an awful long time.
Right,
yeah, I agree really with that. I think the interplay, particularly because the grid connections now being stretched out. I've heard a couple of horror stories about grid connections into 2042. That kind of time scale is so long, and how that is then matched with a planning permission that says it has to be implemented within 3 years, and that presents its own set of problems, because once implemented, that can trigger conditions and potentially a Section 106. So so we can talk about it, but it's a tricky one because of the length of time it can take.
Right, thank you. So we'll go to
hang on. Oops, sorry, Susie. I was just going to add a couple of points on the timing. That's okay, Susie.
Yeah.
So from us, I mean, timing is obviously key. We want to be involved in the beginning, but there's a couple of key points when we look at timing. So one is where there's an option granted for the solar park. Ultimately, it's vital that we tend to look to put a delay in between the exercise of the option and the planning permission, so that we can actually get that tax planning in place. Ideally, we look at that to be at least a month for that, so that we can, often what that tax planning might be to get the land into the limited company. And for us, it's vital that we're looking at doing that before planning is granted, so that if we're looking at getting holdover relief for capital gains tax purposes, that it still qualifies as agricultural.
Right, okay.
So so timing is key. So the sooner the better to have that.
Yeah. Right, thank you. So we'll go into our first question, which is the impact of additional income from electricity generation on the tax status of farmland.
Ooh.
So I guess we are going to be talking about a leased site, I presume, but not necessarily. So I'll leave it to you, Kate, to.
No, it's difficult. Sorry, Susie, it was difficult from that to see whether when they said income generated, it sounded like it was more generating it themselves. But I think on the majority of the situations, I would have thought it's going to be through a leased situation. And looking at how that question's come in when they've talked about tax status, I'm thinking they tend to be looking at what I said was the inheritance tax position.
Yes.
So looking at the two reliefs being available, being agricultural property relief or business property relief. So agricultural property relief being available on farmland and farm buildings being occupied for the purposes of agriculture. That's it in a nutshell as a 2-year general ownership position, and other things that need to be considered, but that's the simplistic view. But if you've got a lease in place, then the land is not going to be occupied by the farmer, and it's not going to be used for the purpose of agriculture. So agricultural property relief would not be available in that situation. Some people say to me, well, what if I've got sheep grazing underneath the solar panels? But primarily the purpose is for the use of those, for that generation of solar. And actually, if you've got a lease in place, you're not the actual person with the occupation, it's the solar company. So unfortunately, it falls foul on both parts in that situation. And that would be the same if you're generating it yourself for agricultural property relief.
So what about business property relief?
Business property relief, I say, is a little bit more interesting, Susie, or a bit more involved, should I say. So business property relief. So here the tax status will depend on whether you're generating that income yourself or you have a lease in place for the solar park. And as a reminder, and for those that are watching, business property relief is available on business properties such as business actual partnership or shares in a trading business. It is not available, and this is the key point, it is not available if a business consists of wholly or mainly in dealing with property or investments. Okay, so if it's internally generated, that's going to be hopefully part of your business, and if it meets the other criteria for business property relief and same similar ownership period of 2 years if you own the land, then BPR should be available. However, if you're in a leased situation, this is ultimately then an investment. You're holding an investment. You're not actually trading that yourself. So BPR would be denied. But then I say, however, you need to consider that there has been some important cases that I'm sure we're all aware of, being the farmer case and Balfour. So Balfour outlined that if you can prove that you have a single business and that overall business is mainly trading, and at the moment, I should say mainly trading is more than 50%, but the government have been looking at waking that up to simplify that in line with CGT, capital gains tax, to be 80-20. So there's that to be aware of as well. But if it's mainly being over the 50%, then BPR could be available on everything, including your non-BPR assets. But then you have to consider that when you look at it and your overall business, is it actually overall farming as the farmer case would have looked at? So with the farmer case, they looked at the context of the farm, where the turnover is generated, where the profits are generated, where the capital is employed, and so forth. And in both cases there, BPR was available. But I think if you've got a substantial solar park, would you be able to argue that actually in context you are mainly farming? So in those situations, what we would look to do is actually look at the whole business and look at protecting your Balfour position with your own partnership. So if you had a partnership where you might have some let properties that again wouldn't qualify for business property relief, but overall that farming partnership would qualify because it was mainly farming, we would look to put the solar park in a separate company to ensure that we're safeguarding that Balfour position within the partnership.
So plenty to write on there. Thank you. There's a common theme to quite a lot of the questions, and that is planning and grid capacity. So we may try and roll some of the questions into each other. And we have one about the South Downs National Park policy. South Downs Park policy currently prohibits turbines, but with only one turbine in the whole park and fast wind speeds, with few other renewable options in solar due to the visual aspects. Is there a way in which local policy change can be fast tracked? And I think that's probably for both Chris and Alex. We'll go to Chris first on that one.
Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, because it is, to an extent, it's crystal ball gazing. I think the simple answer is that no, there probably isn't a way to fast track planning policy change, because the government policy will move as fast as government moves. But I would speculate that with the next year being election year in the direction of travel, then I think this could be something that could be worth keeping an eye on. One thing that's quite interesting is that when most of the wind farms that you see in the country today were built pre-2015, before the effective ban came into place. But in the years since then, the technology has continued to develop. Turbines have become bigger, mostly designed for the offshore wind market rather than onshore. Bigger turbines means, yes, more efficiency and more power, but it also means more noise, more visual impact, and so a more difficult route to get planning. So I've been speaking with a few developers who are saying, very roughly, the distance from a turbine to a house might have to be anywhere from 700 to 1,000 meters for a big modern commercial scale wind turbine. So if you've got to site a wind turbine a kilometer away from a house, and that's every house that you don't live in yourself, that is, you're going to need a lot of open land without many houses on it. But England, or well, the UK as a whole, is very densely populated. And so if you were to look at most of the country and try and find the least densely populated areas, by virtue of where they are, they're going to be national parks, AONBs. They're going to be a lot of land that then has loads of other designations. So I think it's a really interesting discussion. I don't know what the answer is going to be, but if there's going to be support for onshore wind farms, I think there does have to be a serious look at what is going to be the policy around protected landscapes, because they might be the most viable places to build wind farms, but then it's the political sensitivity of the visual impact that they'll have on the landscape. What we can do is speculate about which way that argument's going to go, but if anyone wants to get serious about supporting wind, I think that is going to have to be a really genuine consideration.
Thank you. I think I should have added, because that was about the national park, we had a couple of questions very closely related to that. One is, are wind turbines possible in an AONB? And does being in a green belt affect the chance of getting planning permission for a wind turbine? So, sorry,
yeah,
I didn't mention
the same answer would largely apply. Yeah. I think the green belt one's slightly a different angle, because green belt is then closer to urban, so then you're probably more likely to be close to houses, which potentially means it's less viable for wind. But what we have seen is solar has got lots of planning consents within green belt. So renewables in green belt by default isn't necessarily prohibitive, but wind might not be suitable in green belt, but there might be other technologies that would be.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So we'll go to Alex on that one.
Yeah, I mean, really, just to second what Chris has said. Really, what I've been, because first of all, I think this is a really exciting area. I think the whole distributed nature of generating electricity from smaller sites rather than relying on gas and relying on the more traditional power plants is a fantastic area, and I think it is only going one way. I think, as we've seen, there is it felt a reaction by the government to ease the de facto ban on wind, as even recognition by Rishi Sunak as to the importance of wind being ticking the net zero box, the energy security box, and I feel like it wasn't as far as I was hoping, as we were hoping, in that the infamous footnote 54 of the national policy planning policy framework remains, but it is, as Chris said, slightly reduced in its de facto ban. Is going in the right direction, and I think this is the beginning really of quite an exciting journey regarding wind, because I think public opinion is changing on wind as well. So it seems as though there was a lot of pushback from government because of the concerns around NIMBYism, but it doesn't seem to ring true because of more community engagement, really. So yeah, that's my comment.
Okay, thank you. We've actually got, because you mentioned community engagement, that just triggered a reminder about a question about community fund payments, different aspect of the community, but somebody's asked what's the position regarding community fund payments. Some pay a set value per megawatt for the life of the scheme, others try and do a minimal one-off payment into the local community. Chris or Alex, I'll go to Chris first again, but Alex, jump in there if you've got some thoughts on that.
The simple answer to that is that there is no kind of right or wrong way for developers to do this. So whether it's a one-off lump sum payment or whether it's annual payments, there's no rule book that says explicitly what should or shouldn't happen. But ultimately, it's down to the developers to think about what they can afford to pay and how they can most cost effectively structure it.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, it's their way of trying to get communities support for schemes. And in some cases, it comes down to a negotiation with the local community. So it might be that if the village hall needs to get a new roof on it, getting £5,000 a year for the next 40 years will take a long time before they have the money to re-roof it. So they might prefer a lump sum of cash. Vice versa, if they just want to keep the heating on and just want support for the bills, then annual payments might work. So yeah, simple answer is that there isn't a simple answer. It's very much bespoke. But that really is a negotiation between the community and the developer that's applying.
Thank you. Alex, have you got anything to add on that one?
No, not really. Other than having spoken to Chris, I was interested to hear the broad spectrum of possibilities that's available for that kind of engagement.
Right in thinking that some years ago the government brought in a rule that if a project was above a certain size, that there had to be some sort of community benefit or recognition payment, whatever. I think it was above 5 megawatts then, but it may have changed since.
Over to you, Chris, on that one.
I must admit, I can't remember if there's actually anything legally binding in policy that requires it. But through practice, it's become such a sort of rule of thumb that if you don't include it, you are not going to get your community support. You're not going to get planning support.
Okay.
So whether it's legally required or not, it's pretty fundamental these days.
Yeah. Okay. We've got several questions on grid as well. So again, for both Alex, start with Alex. Is there any schedule that National Grid are working to free up grid connections? This person, particularly in Cornwall, but I'm sure you can talk probably across the whole country, whether there's any regional preferences in terms of speed. In many locations, it's not necessarily just planning that obstructs delivery, but also the lack of grid connections, even though 11/33 kilovolt infrastructure is already on site or nearby in many locations. Alex?
I mean, absolutely. It's throughout the industry, really, and of the last few years, really. It's there's been a lot of noise about the grid delays, and really, I mean, I have some sympathy with the National Grid, the ESO. It's a complicated problem, because it's flipping how energy was distributed on its head as quickly as possible to try and cope with both the generation and supply, and to try and work with the existing infrastructure as much as possible, despite the fact that there is a much more involved, spread out, numerous small sites that are all looking to tap in to generate, and yet also that they're going to need a supply themselves. And there has been many years where the infrastructure there hasn't been the investment in it, and that has been the case, so that some national, I mean, looking at the transmission level, so this is essentially the motorways that travels the electricity is generated up and down the country. That a lot of expense is necessary, and it will kill projects in trying to bring that transmission, the really substantial infrastructure, to a standard that will facilitate a much more complicated demand and supply picture. So as to a timescale, the National Grid, I would say the ESO, so that those that are ultimately responsible for the transmission of electricity above the separate DNOs that are spread throughout the country, they've got a 5-step plan really to try and reduce the queue time. So it was a much more rudimentary system before, but then looking at batteries in a different bracket to the rest of energy generation, because their supply and demand isn't the same as, for example, solar, and they're offering something separate. But it really represents, it's almost a digital transformation that's going on, and the people, so the ESO, that the governance and the systems relating to the control of electricity is going through a huge shift throughout, almost top down, as to how. So I can't say that they've got specific times in mind, but they are working and they're doing engagement to try and target those areas that are in need most. And so, I mean, my first port of call would be, I mean, we can come on to it, but when you're looking at grid connections, I would absolutely recommend anyone, first of all, approaching your distribution network operator, the DNO, to discuss your grid connection. And one thing that I've noticed is that, if you are flexible as to what you're offering to perhaps supply back into the grid, and work with them. They have these surgeries, which is where you have a meeting with them and they talk through the infrastructure around the local primary substation. And I was part of a very positive meeting, which is initially they'd said it's going to cost millions. It'll kill the project because of the reinforcement works that's necessary to the transmission. But if the development was to reduce so that its maximum output was less, it could suit the community so that level of reinforcement wasn't necessary, and there was a slight change in the setup for the renewable project. It actually meant that there was a connection time of 2027, and there wasn't reinforcement costs. So I would also absolutely recommend them.
So what sort of capacity did they have to sacrifice then to make the project smaller, in percentage terms?
Oh, I mean, in that instance, actually, it was I think it was a 10 megawatt project, so a pretty sizable project, and that it was it had to be, the idea was that it was going to be a battery, and it was roughly about 4 megawatts of deduction, but because of the lack of the need for paying for the very expensive reinforcement works, meant that it still potentially stacked up, so that it didn't kill it.
Yeah, good. Yeah, just looking at a couple more questions on grid, there's quite a bit of frustration. One person saying, is there going to be any improvement? I can get a 1 megawatt connection, but only 160 kilowatt export facility. It's a bit of a farce. So I don't know whether you've come across situations like that, Chris or Alex.
Yeah, it's a perpetual problem at the moment, and Alex did a good talk about, it's a legacy of lack of investment, but also it's a Victorian network. It's 100 years old, designed for something totally different to what we're trying to do now. And so I do have sympathy for the grid, that they do have all kinds of problems they're trying to solve desperately, but fires are being lit all around them and they're firefighting each one, but it takes time. What they do have is they do have a plan of solutions to a lot of these problems, but often developers, and by virtue of that, landowners, are getting the brunt of the problems with it. I've had projects where we had plans to connect this year, but then got a phone call from the grid 12 months ago saying, actually, it's now being delayed till 2032, and we've got to sit and twiddle our thumbs. Now, through these measures that the grid are implementing to speed up connections, we expect the connection will happen quicker than 2032, but it's certainly not happening this year. It might be 5 years or so. This could easily be the topic of an entire other webinar, and I know there are grid consultants have lots of discussion on it. If people are interested, they can do some digging. There's all kinds. I don't think I want to spend too long on it for fear that I'll get carried away, but there are solutions in place. But
just to put us in how
you're doing as well. So I've seen a couple of questions. That question about 1 megawatt connection but only having 150 kilowatts. What they're probably meaning is they can take 1 megawatt out of the grid but only put 150 kilowatts back into the grid. That is quite a valid point to bring up, that if we're talking about renewables, we're sending power in one direction. If we're talking about battery storage or something else, the power needs to come in to charge batteries and go out. So suddenly you're looking at twice the connection because you need two-way power. So they're even more challenging to connect. But at the same time, they're solving problems that the grid are facing with supply and demand. So the grid want them to connect and are trying to make it easier for them to plug in. So yeah, without going into great detail about the many measures in place, there are plans to improve them, but it is a problem that everyone is facing the brunt of. If we apply for a connection today, do not expect it to be within the next 5, even 10 years at this rate.
Well, we've got a question here from somebody who has been offered an upgrade to their line, and it's a very practical question. They've got low power output, single phase transformer on a small farm. They've got a 4 kilowatt solar array. They want to expand more solar and potentially a single wind turbine, but Western Power, they've been told Western Power wants to charge them £40,000 to upgrade the line. They've already maxed the feed-in capacity with the array that they've got. Is there any help or support they can get to get Western Power to upgrade the line that comes to them? I don't know if there's any possibility of collaboration with other people that are after a similar
potentially, but the reality is there's no sort of subsidy or kind of support in that sense. One thing I'd probably flag with that, people who are looking at this kind of scale of investing in their own renewable energy, although electricity prices are high now, that if you're buying power off the grid, it's expensive. If you're selling power to the grid, you're still not achieving really eye-watering sums. There are no subsidies available for that electricity anymore. And forecasts are that even if the prices stay high for a couple of years, they'll probably drop back down to more normal levels again in the near future. So whenever I've looked at this, it's been really difficult to make the numbers stack up, exporting power to the grid, working just on the sale price of electricity. It can stack up if you're using the power on site, offsetting your own consumption and saving the market price cost that you'd be paying. But without the feed-in tariff subsidy, it is very difficult to make a profit from exporting the power. So probably rather than looking too much at the fear of spending 40 grand upgrading Western Power's network, maybe there's a conversation to be had with any other local businesses. Could they take some of that supply? You bypass the grid entirely, and you supply to someone who needs that power direct. You can get a premium on the price. You save that 40 grand bill. That's obviously tricky for people in really remote areas, but if you've got some industrial uses or occupiers in any sheds, it's definitely worth having those conversations.
Well, we've got a question on exactly that. Is there scope to sell electricity produced by a turbine? I guess the same applies whether it's solar, wind, AD, whatever, to other nearby commercial third-party electricity users. How is this done? How does it work in practice? And how could the electricity be metered to the third parties? It's a big question. There's probably could have a whole webinar just on private wire agreements, but it would be a customer who's got a consistent demand. How do you manage supply to a customer who's got a consistent demand from a turbine that's got inconsistent or variable output? But again, we're back to batteries again then.
Yeah, and that then is all going to be about weighing up the investment and the return, because arguably you could do a wind turbine and combine it with some solar panels. So if it's sunny but there's no wind, you've got some consistency to generation. And you could look at battery storage and go for it, throw the kitchen sink at the problem. But every one of those adds cost, and batteries in particular are very, very expensive.
Yeah.
They are cost effective if you don't really have many other options. And if you're doing a completely off-grid scheme and the grid's too expensive, this could be cheaper. But in that kind of a scenario, unfortunately, it's probably going to be a question mark as to what's more expensive. That customer having a main supply as a backup and then just taking power off the grid when the turbine's not spinning, or that person investing in solar batteries, another turbine, whatever it might be, improve their generation. But if they oversupply and waste that power, that's lost investment. There's no easy answer, but they might need to do analysis, compare the two costs and see which one works.
But it's an option, where all the circumstances are right.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mentioned batteries. It applies to all technologies, but batteries are the easy solution in theory to a lot of these problems. But in practice, the costs are still really high. And it does make sense, but only a limited number of circumstances. It's certainly not a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah. Kate, do you want to come in on the tax side there? If you're a farmer, landowner generating energy by whatever means and selling it fairly locally, is that you're still trading? So the tax is just a straightforward proposition, is it? You're muted, Kate.
Sorry, there I go then. So it's more straightforward in the fact that yes, it would be trading and taxable income. It's a point to make that actually, depending on the amounts involved, you then need to also consider the VAT implications. Whereas obviously, if it's just a lease, and if the land is not opted to tax, then that wouldn't have any VAT.
Yeah. So the supply would be vatable, would it?
Taxable.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to add, just before we move on, just regarding the possibility of bypassing really and having a private wire, I think it is an option. I mean, you avoid the issues with a grid queue and a connection time that many years down the road. I think the concern about having purely a private wire connection without an overspill to the grid is that you've got a fixed customer who's going to be paying your electricity that you've got installed and geared up for, and you've got a difficulty if that they stop paying for whatever reason, then there's limited options without the ability to divert to the grid. So it's something to consider really.
Thank you. But back to planning briefly now. is there a planning policy difference for larger farms? I think they probably mean larger installations and small holdings where permitted development might be available. I think the permitted development rights are pretty limited on energy installations, but Chris, perhaps you can fill us in on that, or Alex.
Sure. I think I'll try and avoid getting into too much detail because the intricacies of permitted development are very technical, but there are permitted development rights available. So things like rooftop solar, ground-mounted solar, other types of technology, even very small wind turbines can get permission through permitted development rights. But they're all generally of a scale that's kind of domestic scale. So, it works to supply a house, but it wouldn't generally work to supply the kind of things that we might be talking about.
Yeah.
You certainly can do it at that level, but the cost effectiveness becomes a little bit questionable.
Yeah.
Rooftop is probably one of the most generous permitted development rights. But if you ever think about ground-mounted stuff, the rules are relatively strict, and it's quite quick on the PD limit, at which point you're going into full planning.
I think Scotland has slightly more generous allowances than England on those. Right, okay. We have got lots more questions. I'm just going to have a look, see if we can find another one. Yeah, has there been any recent planning update on land grading and solar? I think it's a short answer to that one. Alex, perhaps for you?
There's been rumbles, hasn't there, about solar and the risk that I know that was thrown around, but whilst there was the tussle between Liz Truss and Rishi about solar going on top grade arable land, and there being a recent suggestion, I think, in the Guardian that was being refloated. But I know that there's been a significant uproar, given that solar, I think, occupies less than golf courses up and down the country, to suggest that the country is full of solar. And so that there's been, I think, substantial pushback on a blanket rejection of solar in those allocated arable areas. But more than that, really, I don't know it being more of a kind of specific planning point.
Okay. Somebody's commented that it's not really a question, but the discussion seems to be very land-based. What about the scope for rooftop schemes? Alex, I don't know whether you're involved in any large or small rooftop schemes, and
sorry,
what the scope is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have done. I mean, they are by their nature more complicated, because you would have. I mean, this is on a commercial scale, so you've got residential or on a smaller scale, which is a slightly different position. But regarding rooftop developments for solar, it lends itself to it, really, in that there's otherwise wasted space, and you've got the captive potential client for the solar that you generate in the agricultural, the building, whether it's commercial or agricultural, underneath. And so there are just the complications that go with it around the lease itself, and this is on the basis that it's a developer that's doing the solar roof space development.
And are they still are they in the market for rooftop development?
I mean, so I've done a few, but they are just the few rather than the vast majority that is on standard ground mounted solar.
Okay. Right, I've got someone here they've got a turbine on their land, and the lifespan, and they put in brackets planning permission of the project, is almost halfway past. if the company decides to end the scheme as a landowner, sorry, I'm just trying to make sense of the question. So should they decide to end the scheme, apply to extend it, or repower it, what advice can you give them? Possibly one for Chris. I don't know. I know a lot of solar leases are being extended way beyond the original 25 years that was planned for the project. Same with wind turbines. And what are the landowners' options?
Absolutely. I know the wind farm in question from that one, so I'll try and separate it from too much experience. But generally, it's a very valid issue that as the turbines, the first wind farms that were getting built in the country now are nearing the end of their planning consent, nearing the end of their lease term, and it's something that needs to be looked at by any landowner with those kind of wind farms to make sure that things like the decommissioning fund provisions are up to speed, make sure any clearing the site protections are being enforced properly, because you've only got so many years left to get those into place. And also there's a big question then to speak with the developer about what's going to happen to the future of this project. Now, I think, again, this is speculation on my part, but with the sort of gradual move that we're seeing towards more onshore wind farm support in England, my gut feeling is that the first people who will put planning applications in will probably be replacing existing wind farms, decommissioning the old ones, putting new turbines in their place. Politically, I'd expect that is going to be a much easier pill to swallow. And only once we've seen some traction with them are we likely to see more ambitious developers putting applications in for a greenfield site that's never seen a wind turbine. That is only speculation on my part, but I think there's definitely a valid conversation to be had there. On the flip side, some developers, if those turbines are still working well and still performing and generating an income, then they could go to the cost of replacing them, or for next to no money, they could apply to extend their planning consent, extend the lease on the land, and just keep the same turbines running. As long as the maintenance cost isn't too high, they could do that. But ultimately, it all comes down to a negotiation, and it really, as I know in this case, it all comes down to how engaging the developer is in that conversation. And you can ask them, and you can try and get them sat around the table, but it's up to them whether they come to the table, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Right, back to our questions. It's another one which might be more of a legal question. So, Alex, when a developer makes a grid application that's linked to a specific area of land with the agreement of the landowner, can the developer then use that connection for another third-party land? So I guess it's using one person's land to access another, I think is the basis of that.
So it would be, so there's a grid application that's gone in,
Yeah.
and it's based on an area, and that it actually transpires that they're going to look to for others to benefit from it over.
Yes, sorry, it's can they use that connection for another third party's land? So benefiting from the original application.
Yeah, so I'd interpret that as if you've got, say, a 30 megawatt solar farm on the land, but the connection is 50 megawatts, could they build 20 megawatts nearby and
next door or
run it through our system?
Yeah.
So I think there's a couple of things that, as I understood it, at the transmission level, they weren't, and I think this is at the application stage. So the big infrastructure projects, they're less concerned about the actual location than the smaller scale, the DNOs, and that I think I've come across it before where developers have applied and then it not quite matching what actually they're envisaging, and it being a substantial issue regarding the DNO scale, whereas at the transmission it's not quite. But as I say, that's hearsay, so I don't get too involved at all really with the connection side of things. So that would be my only comment. is that from what I've heard, you have to be pretty specific, certainly at the DNO level. But ultimately, it's to do with what gets fed into the grid. So I don't know how much work it would actually take to extend it.
Yeah, I think that behind the question is probably also the first landowner's rights. Obviously, the developer has the connection and the access to that land. But could they then use that land in order to benefit on another project nearby?
So there's quite a few things to consider. But if, for example, you've got one site that has a connection and that it has rights of your cable route potentially that connects into that point of connection at a DNO level, say, then there are risks that the actual private rights of way in laying the cables won't extend to the additional land that you then look to try and incorporate. So you can't channel additional land through another parcel of land that has the benefit. So you've got your land rights side, which is separate from your grid connection side. And I know that developers look to try and there's been a relatively recent case on this about having two separate solar developments, I think it was, to avoid it going over the 50 megawatt threshold and then falling into the nationally significant infrastructure project, which is a separate planning regime that goes through the planning inspectorate. That you're talking really significant investment in money and time to get that through. And again, that could be a separate webinar on the intricacies of the judgment and what was deemed as a connection, separate site, and what was deemed as the same.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just looking for other questions. Kate, this is it's a big change of tack, and it's more of a general question, but might as well throw it in because obviously it relates to the subject as well. Do you think agricultural property relief will remain in place if there's an incoming Labour government? It's one of those $1 million questions.
Oh, it really is, isn't it? Yeah. Who knows, I think is the question. I know Keir Starmer is keen to abolish both property relief and agricultural property relief. And I think isn't it estimated that by doing so would generate something like 4 billion, which they say is generated through a current loophole in the system, which I do not think is fair. Personally, I think there will be some reform. And I know with the CLA at the moment are lobbying to reconsider the definition of agriculture for inheritance tax purposes. So a lot of the current agreements, and when you look at B&G and so forth, that wouldn't qualify as agriculture. But on the other side of that, you could look at it and go, well, then you're just taking food out of production, and the government then will be opposed to that. And what I think, just cutting it short, I suppose, is what we're sort of thinking is what they're really trying to stop is the people coming down and buying the land. I don't want to say Jeremy Clarkson, but if you're thinking of people that are landowners coming down, using that money and obviously obtaining those inheritance tax reliefs when a lot of them are actually not farming it themselves, I think there will be some reduction or some changes to perhaps mitigate that.
I think there was a Office of Tax Simplification and Review of inheritance tax some years ago, and around a similar time, I think that recognised that if you abolished an APR, then it would mean the breakup of lots of farms. Yeah. There was a subsequent Labour paper that sort of acknowledged that and said that wouldn't be the
so there's been several things going around, hasn't there, as whether actually, like I said earlier when I was talking about an inheritance tax, whether they actually again simplify it so that mainly farming, mainly trading comes up to the same requirements for capital gains tax, so 80% instead of 50%, which would affect a lot of our estates. So we're already sort of looking at that in case that was to come into play. and also where you're getting the uplift on death for capital gains tax purposes and so forth. So looking at perhaps what they call loopholes there. But I completely agree, Susie. At the end of the day, agricultural property relief should be there to ensure that the farmers can consider long-term succession and enable the farm to be moved down the generations without having to break it up and pay inheritance tax.
Right, there's another tax one, but this takes us back to renewables. Do pension companies accept renewables, for example, in land into SIPs, self-invested personal pension schemes that might have renewables on the land?
Yeah, I was talking to somebody yesterday about this actually, and short answer would be yes, but pension companies do tend to take a very long time and don't really understand the structure and so forth, and doesn't therefore tend to be very popular from my personal experience.
Right, okay. Thank you. Right. Oh, perhaps there's another one for Kate. When you're modelling a solar scheme, what inflation rate do you use? I don't know whether this is for your own, for a landowner's own scheme, or whether it might be tied to, and this might come back to Chris or Alex.
I think that would be a Chris and Alex one.
Tied to what sort of inflation rate would you work into the proposal for the payments to the landowner?
Yeah, we'd get it at heads of term, Alex. So I don't know if that's something that either Chris or Alex, maybe Chris. Yeah.
From the landowner's perspective, if it's a commercial development with a big developer behind it, they will be the ones doing the modelling rather than the landowner. So the only times that the landowners would be modelling it really directly would be if they were investing in their own scheme. But I mean, then it's when you're talking about inflation, it's very much how long is a piece of string and what guesses are you going to make. Because at the same time, if you're forecasting inflation, you're also then forecasting how electricity price is going to change, and that's probably going to have a far bigger effect than inflation, because the electricity price is going to be driven by inflation, but so is the maintenance cost, so is all of the work, all costs are going to go up with inflation more or less the same. It's only really the figures that change disproportionately to inflation that I think you're going to be wanting to focus on even more. So yeah, I'm sorry, that's not a very clean answer to it. I don't think it's as simple as just saying we can apply a standard inflation rate. If you're doing a detailed model, you're forecasting so many different variables that inflation is one small element. I think, yeah, there's a much bigger topic there that would need to be covered if we wanted to go into it.
Okay. And somebody has asked a question about small-scale hydrogen on farm. I'm just trying to find the question now. But really, it was about what are the prospects and viability. Is there anything that either of you is seeing, Alex or Chris?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. Well, unless Alex has anything to say.
No, I haven't come across small-scale hydrogen.
No, I think I personally think hydrogen in theory is really exciting because it could solve so many problems in terms of an oversupply of electricity, using that to generate hydrogen, and then that's effectively a store of energy. And I mean, if you go down that rabbit hole, you can look at like JCB for investing in hydrogen engines because you can't use batteries on a 360 digger that runs 20 hours a day. So hydrogen's a big area of research, but the efficiency of it is really abysmal. It's only something like 5-6% of the electricity you put in comes out as usable energy in hydrogen. There might be a better figure than that, but it's not an exciting figure. And hydrogen's really leaky, so if you pump it into the natural gas network, it will just leak out through all the cracks. It will have to be in its own unique, super sealed pipeline network. There are trials of hydrogen in the northeast of England, the Tees Port scheme. I think Newcastle, Middlesbrough Uni has got grant funding combined with Tees Port and Tees Valley Combined Authority. They're going to produce hydrogen off lots of renewable energy to run road and rail networks, Tees Port, that sort of stuff. But that's all research work. Same, there's the HyNet in Cheshire, which is a centralised hydrogen production facility, but using natural gas. So it's not green hydrogen. But that is then central generation distributed to local heavy industry. We are many, many years away from kind of on-farm scale localized hydrogen generation. Probably 10 years of research is still going to have to happen before we can get anywhere near that stage. So it's an exciting topic. It's fun to read into and fun to talk about, but sadly, it's no solution at this stage.
Okay, all right. Big question now on the issue of food security, land grade, and whether too much land might be taken out by solar. Actually, I wanted to ask Alex and Chris what the demand is currently for large solar sites. Is it still very strong? There's certainly a lot going in, and then I'll go back into this question, which is probably going to have to be the last one.
Yeah, demand effectively is unlimited at this point, more or less, because there's near infinite amount of money being pumped in. I've been in the industry for 10 years, and even now I'm still hearing of 2 new companies a week on average,
really?
just set up purely to build solar farms. So the market is absolutely enormous.
Yeah.
Really, the only restriction is availability of land, grid connection, planning consent. If every bit of land could be built on, I think there's near enough resources to do it.
Okay.
So yeah, it's planning and administrations that are actually keeping the development under control.
So this question is asking whether, with the risk, as they see it, of too much land being taken out of food production, is agrivoltaics the answer? Is it viable, if it's viable? They're in Suffolk, the 5 or 6 NSIP, nationally significant infrastructure project scale solar farms coming forward, which could take 15,000 acres or more out of food production. So yeah, perhaps a word on agrivoltaics.
Well, I'm happy to just quickly jump in that there's competing interests on there. I mean, with the agri land, and I think going back, absolutely, I think that there's adequate land to accommodate a significant growth in solar, and that's just based off what I can only, and perhaps being slightly biased, is some scaremongering by national newspapers as to the scale of solar developments, but putting it into the perspective about the golf courses and all of the solar so far taking up, I think, less than the extent of land of all the golf courses combined. And then I've seen charts where that in itself represents such a small percentage of available agricultural land. That's my own opinion, really.
Right, thank you very much. Well, we haven't got near all the questions. I'm just looking for one where we might quickly answer it in the 2 minutes that we have left. One is, bear with me. Odd one here, because it's something that I've never heard of, but probably should have. What are the key areas to be aware of when negotiating a sleeving agreement? Alex, can you tell me what a sleeving agreement is?
So, as far as I'm aware, that sleeving agreement is it's a direct link between an energy developer and a consumer of energy. So you're an agricultural business, and rather than looking to energy providers that have what are called carbon credits, that have been put into question, really, about their validity, just based on the fact that they're traded, that people lose sight. It doesn't account for what's deemed as additionality, which is actually promoting more renewables. It's just trading what's already there. Then the sleeving is a contract, which is you have a grid connection, but you have, or a virtual PPA, I've heard it called, where you have a contract with a developer of solar, which is a direct supply, but it goes through the DNO network, so it's not a private wire as we were talking about before. Is that it travels through the grid. It's just that it's a direct contractual relationship about the supply. So I mean, it doesn't overcome the grid queue issue because it still gets fed into the grid, but there is greater visibility, and I understand it's greater from a the position of the business is to show that we are supporting, say, a reasonably local solar farm because we have this sleeving PPA, this power purchase agreement, and that we buy what's generated. And I think
sorry, I'm going to probably have to
yeah.
interrupt you because I'm being warned that we're almost out of time. So I'd just like to thank all three of you very quickly. Thank the audience for attending. We've galloped over a lot of ground, and there's a lot more questions still to answer. So we may be able to provide answers to those that ask them separately outside the webinar. Thank you, all three of you very much, Alex, Chris, and Kate. And thanks to our audience for signing up and attending. I hope it's been useful.
Thanks, Susie.
Thank you.